Hey guys, welcome to the first lesson in this Python tutorial series, where we're going to learn not only the basics of Python, but the fundamentals of programming. Python is a super easy language to pick up for beginners due to its easy syntax, and through it, we'll be learning about things like variables, if statements, loops, and arrays, which exist in almost all programming languages, as well as creating a few fun little projects along the way. Don't worry if you've never coded before, as this series is intended for beginners. If you already know a little bit of code, say Java, feel free to skip through the video and watch only what you need to. With that being said, let's jump right into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is output, but before we can do that, we need to talk about what a compiler is. Basically, a compiler is something that will take your code that you've typed out and then compile it. That's basically just a fancy way of saying that it's going to read your program and then run it. For example, if I type out some lines of code in Notepad, let's say print hello world, nothing happens. There's no way to run it, and that's why we need a specific compiler. For Python, there's a ton of different options out there that you can use, but for now I'm going to use online GDB because it's easy to use without having to download or set anything up. All you have to do is go to Google and just search up online GDB Python, and it should be the first option that comes up. In Python, the syntax is super easy. Whereas in a language like Java, you have a lot more setup code and syntax to worry about. Here, for your first program, all you have to do is say print. So if I hit run, we see that this program, well, it prints, right? And printing is basically just displaying something in the console. And by the way, the console is this window on the bottom of the page. And this is where you'll see things like print, as well as any error messages that you might get. So anyways, if print just prints out whatever we put inside of here, if we change this, it should also change. So instead of saying hello world, let's just say hello and then run it. Alright, cool. It says hello. So when we're dealing with text, we have to put it inside of these quotation marks. And that's so that the program, the computer, knows that it's a string, which is basically just text. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later when we're dealing with variables and when it's more important. Just know for now that when we're dealing with text, you want to make sure that it's put inside of quotation marks. Alright. However, when we're dealing with numbers, let's just do an example. Let's say 2. We can just say print 2, hit run, and it works. Alright, so that's kind of boring. It's really the same thing as printing out text. But in Python, we can do math operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, everything you can do in math basically. So I'll just quickly go through these. Plus and minus are just, well, plus and minus, right? So 2 plus 5, easy. I can do minus. I can say like 9 minus 5, right? Gives us pretty obvious answers. Multiplication is going to be the asterisk sign. So if you just run that, it should give us that. And division is /. So if you run it, it's going to give us a decimal answer. The last operation we're going to talk about is something called modulus. So this is something that you probably haven't used before in your math class, but it's pretty simple. When we use modulus or mod, it's just a percentage sign. And what it does is it's going to, sorry, that's not the percentage sign. What it's going to do is divide it and then return the answer, which is basically just the remainder. So for example, if we said 9 mod 2, what it's going to do is divide 9 by 2 and then give you the remainder. So if you run this, it should give us an answer of 1. If the two numbers are divisible, let's say 9 and 3 for example, well, since the remainder is 0, the answer it gives us is also 0. So this is really useful when you're trying to find out if a number is odd or even, which we'll be doing later on, right? If a number is odd, when it's divided by 2, it's not going to give you an even number. It's not divisible by 2. But if a number is divisible by 2, which means it's even, it's going to give you an answer of 0. For example, 9 and 2, like we did earlier, this gave us an answer of 1. But if we did something like 4 or 6, we run it, it's going to give us 0. Alright, now let's talk about variables. What is a variable? If you've taken a math class, you might have heard about variables being x or y, and then you have to solve to find them. In math, they work as placeholders and represent another number. For example, if we say x equals 46, and then we say x plus 54, we know that we're not literally saying the letter x plus 54. x represents another number, in this case 46, and we're going to be adding the two numbers together, not the letter and the number. In coding, it's pretty similar, except instead of just numbers, we can also use variables to represent other things like text, when later on we'll be representing programming objects, which we'll talk about in the future. For now, you can think of a variable like a box, and inside of this box, we place some kind of value, whether it's a number like an integer or a string, which is just text. So how do we create a variable in Python? It's actually super easy, and we kind of did here. I'll just delete it and do it again. All we have to do is give it a variable name. In this case, let's say num. Then we're going to set it equal to something. Let's say it equals 5. And in this case, the equal sign doesn't mean equivalence like in math, but assigning. So if you go back to the box analogy, the equal sign is just instructing the computer to take the number and place it inside of the box. So in this example, our variable name was num, and the value we assigned to it, or we put inside the box, was 5. So now we've created a variable. If we print out this variable, let's go here and we'll say print, and inside of the parentheses we're going to put num. Now if you run it, it prints out 5, right? The value that num represents. Notice that in this case, like with numbers and operations, we didn't place this in quotation marks. And that's because we wanted to not print out literally as a string, but to print out the variable, right? Print out what it represents. So if we were to put this in quotation marks and run it, let's see what happens. It doesn't recognize it as a variable name, so it doesn't print out 5. Instead, it's just going to print out the string, right? Just like if we typed in hello world and it printed it out exactly like we typed it, it does the same thing here. All right, cool. So if we go back to printing out num, if we change num, let's say we change it to be 15, for example, and we run it, we see that num also changes, right? That's because the variable, right, whenever you change it, whatever you do with it is also changing. We can also change the variable after it's been created. So for example, we're going to start off with num. It's going to have an initial value of 15. But then if we say num equals 20, when we print out, what is it going to give us? Let's run it and see. It gives us 20, because 20 was the last value that we assigned to num, right? The last value that we put inside the box, and that's what we're going to be printing out. If we continue with this box analogy, we can think of it as a box, and initially we put in this number 15. Then what we did was we took out the number 15 and we placed it with another one, 20, and then we printed that out. So in that case, when we printed it out, the box was containing the number 20. We can also replace it with other things like text. So we say hello world, for example. And when we print it, it's not going to be 15, right? Because it's been changed and replaced with hello world. So now we see that we can change these. All right, to wrap up this lesson, let's do a simple exercise. We're going to have two variables, and the goal is to switch them. So I'm just going to start off by typing out some code. We're going to say num1 equals, let's say 3, num2 is going to be equal to 5. And then we're going to print out num1, and then print out num2. So your goal is to get these two numbers to switch somehow without hard coding it. So what I mean by that is we're not going to say num1 equals 5 like that, right? Because then if we change this value, it wouldn't be working. So I'm going to encourage you guys to pause the video right here and just think about it for a second. Alright, so hopefully you've had a minute to think about it, and it's okay if you didn't think of a solution. If you did, let's see if you're correct. So the easiest way to solve this problem is to create a third temporary variable. We won't be using this later on, hence the name temporary, but it's necessary to store one of the values so it isn't lost. So let's create a new variable. We'll call it temp. So we'll say temp equals, and what are we going to set it equal to? You can set it equal to either of them, but we're going to go with num1. So right now, temp is going to be storing the same value as num1, in this case 3. Now what are we going to do? We want num1 to have the value of num2, so all I have to do is say num1 equals num2. So at this point in the code, num1 is going to be equal to num2, which is 5, and num2 is still going to have 5. But we need num2 to have the same initial value as num1. How do we do that? Well, luckily, we stored the value of num1 initially inside of a temp variable. So all we have to do now is say num2 equals temp. So now if you run it, it gives us 5 and 3, right? So num1 is 5 now instead of sorry, num1 is 5 now instead of 3, and num2 is 3 now instead of 5. And this works with any number, right? Even if we change num2 to, let's say, 100, it's still going to switch and it's going to work perfectly. So hopefully that wasn't too complicated. If it was a little bit confusing at first, don't worry, just go ahead and maybe rewatch that section again and just try to think it through and try to understand it. Alright, so that's all for this lesson. Today we learned about outputting to the screen, variables, and basic operations. Next time we'll learn a little bit more about getting the user input and creating a bit of a more interactive program. Alright, see y'all then.